Welcome CSE 103 to exercise 17, which is called Show Hide Patrick. It's going to use HTML, CSS, and it's also going to introduce JavaScript, which is a web-based programming language. And what's going to happen with this exercise is we're just going to do a little bit of HTML, and here's an example right here. There's just a headline, there's a subheadline, there's a paragraph, and there's two buttons. And what's going to happen when we click on the button that says Show Pat, it's going to show Patrick. And when we click on the button that says Hide Pat, it's going to hide Patrick. And basically what's happening here are these buttons are running JavaScript functions. And that's allowing us to contact the image that's here. There's actually an image here, and we're just putting it on the web page, and it has an ID name, and we're calling that ID name, and we're saying make the opacity 100%. Because initially, when the page comes up, its opacity is turned down to 0, meaning it's transparent. And this function makes the transparency 100%. And it also changes this headline from saying where's Patrick to here's Patrick. And then there's a function on this button that's going to change the opacity back to 0 again. And then it's going to change this text element to say where's Patrick. So that's all that's happening. So it's just kind of a on-off kind of thing that's going on here, but it's new, so we're going to introduce it slowly with just something like that. So it's introducing interactivity to HTML and CSS. Typically things are a little more static, so this adds a little more interactivity. And let me just show you the code a little bit. The index HTML, there's not a lot of code here. There's just a couple things in the body. There's an H1, H2, a paragraph, and two buttons, and then there's an image of Patrick. And I'll have that for you on the web so you don't have to put an image in here. Now we are going to keep our JavaScript file in here, and we are going to keep the link to our JavaScript file in here. And that's all it's going to do. It's just going to link to the JavaScript file, just like our link to the CSS file is over here. Now let's look at the CSS. Not a lot going on. Just a background color, a margin, and a font size. So it's giving the background color of blue, it's putting a margin around here, and it's just making the font size a little bit bigger, which we've been doing each time. And there's an ID. So far we've used classes. Now this uses an ID. You can have multiple classes, but you can only have one ID named Patrick. And basically we're taking the image and just giving it an ID name of Patrick, and it's going to start off with its opacity down at 0, and also its width is 300, so it's a little bit smaller, just like we did with other images. And then we're going to change that with JavaScript. And there's also a declaration here for H1, which is changing the color of the headline, which is creating that kind of pink color. And I'm not sure if that even looks good. It still looks a little kind of electric looking on the blue. I haven't found the right color there quite yet. It would probably look better with a white outline or something. But anyway, the JavaScript, now this is our programming language. And if you remember Python, how we used to have a function definition, which basically was what the function was doing, and then this thing is the function call. That's actually making the function happen. So the function definition here, there's a function called showPat, and it looks like there's a lot of stuff here, but it's very simple. When you start typing it, it'll finish it for you. And it's going to get an element by ID, and we're going to get the Patrick element, and we're going to make the CSS style. We're going to turn the opacity back up to 1, which is 100%. And then we're also going to change one of the elements, change its HTML text to be here's Patrick. So two things are happening in this one function, and this is the function call. And it uses something called .addEventListener. So it puts a listener onto the button, and it basically goes on a click event, and it runs the showPat function, which is this one. And once you do that, this one's pretty easy. It's the same thing, except it's just changing the opacity to 0, and it's changing the text to where's Patrick, and it's running the hidePat function. So it's not a lot of code here. It's not a lot of stuff. So I'll talk you through it, and we'll take it slow so you understand everything. I mean, you could just look at the code and type it, but I want you to understand what's happening when we do this. So this is a little introduction to JavaScript. So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be showing Patrick and hiding Patrick. So let's get started. Now I'm going to start this from scratch in Replit. So when you come to Replit, you want to make sure that you go to your repels, my repels. And if you have a folder, you can click on the folder. And I'm going to go up here to create repel. And once again, we'll use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So I'll select that if it comes up as a favorite. If not, search it, just type HTML and it will come up. And then over here, call it 17 show hide Patrick. You could just call it show hide Pat, and you could put dash and put your initials. That way, if I fork it into my account, I have initials on it that make it a little bit different. And then hit create repel. And like usual, we're going to start off with an index HTML. And we're also going to have a JavaScript and a CSS in here. And this time we are going to use the JavaScript. So I'm going to move this over. But before I do, I'm going to open this up in a new tab. That way it'll be here and ready to go. And it just says hello world. And then I'll move this over because I don't need this in here right now. So what I'm going to do, just like the other exercises that we've worked on in Replit with HTML and CSS, is let's change the title, and I'll just call it 17 show hide Patrick. And remember, when you do the title, you can put spaces in here, so it's no big deal. You could do that. You could put your last name. I'll just put Homa here. And we'll keep the link to style.css because we're probably going to use some styles. And then the body, we're not going to use hello world, get rid of that, but we're going to keep our script. And what I'm going to do here is just going to put JavaScript link. I'm going to type JavaScript link, and you can put below. And then I'm going to highlight this, and I'm going to use an HTML comment just to separate this. So it's just a comment that's going to be like a separator. And the way you make a comment is you could highlight this and use command ? And that becomes an HTML comment. And then you can add more dashes in here to be more of a separator. You could count, if you want them even, you could count them. But I'll just do something like that. And I'll even create some space here. Now, they do put this in the body, so I'm going to leave it in the body because sometimes it's recommended to keep your JavaScript as the last thing that runs on a page. So I'm going to keep it here inside the body, and that shouldn't be a problem. We're going to put all our other body stuff above here, so I'm just going to separate that a little bit. So our HTML is going to go in here. We changed our title. We're keeping our link to our style.css, and then we're going to put JavaScript in there last. So let's get some HTML in here. And remember, we're going to put in H1 first. So after body, I'll hit return. And again, if you want to backspace to the margin and hit tab, you could do that. Although that looks, I think that's at the same place. Not sure why this is in a little bit. I always like a full tab here, and that's where that should be. And then we'll just type H1 and tab, and that'll use the Emmet shortcut. And I'll just put show hide Patrick. And then after that, I'll put an H2 and hit tab. And then inside there, I'll put where's Patrick because he's going to start off transparent. We won't see him. So I'll put where's Patrick, and I'll use a question mark. So that'll be kind of a sub headline. And then I'll put a P. So I'll use P and then tab. And then inside the P tags, I'll put hit the button to show or hide Patrick. So those are the instructions in case you need instructions to do that. And then we're going to put two buttons. So after the P, we're going to type button, and I'll put ×2. I'll use an asterisk, and I'll put a 2, and then hit tab. Again, we're using the Emmet shortcut to do this, and that way there's two buttons. And we can leave these on the same line. I think I'd rather have them on different lines, even though the buttons are going to be side by side. In between the buttons, I'm going to put show Pat. Now this is just a label on the button, and inside this one, I'm going to put hide Pat, because we're going to show him first, then we're going to hide him. And I guess we could put Patrick so we know who it is. And what we can do right away is we're going to give our button an ID. So we could say button ID equals, and in quotes, I'm going to put Pt1 and finish the quote. And then inside this tag for the button, I'll put ID equals, and I'll put Btn2. Now, Btn should be in quotes, so you could then highlight that and then hit the quotes, and it'll wrap the quotes around it. Sometimes that's easier. Now, I don't need the spaces in here, so I could take these out, or you could leave them in. Just be consistent. So I'll put spaces around them. So we have ID names. Just like we had class names, ID names are very similar, except they're only meant to be used once. You could have multiple classes used throughout your HTML, but IDs are meant to be used once. And when you identify them in CSS, they'll have a pound sign. Those are our buttons. Let's just see what it looks like. So I'll hit run, and I'll go up here and refresh it. And that's what it looks like. Show hide Patrick, where's Patrick? And I want a little more space between here. So what you can do is put non-breaking spaces. So after this button, I'm going to put an ampersand and put NBSP, non-breaking space, NBSP. So that's what I'll use, and I'll put 2 of them. And I could just copy this and put another one. And you can put a third if you want. So those are non-breaking spaces. They start off with an ampersand, end with a semicolon. And there's 3 of them. So if I go up here and refresh it, now I have a little space in here. You can't just hit the space bar with HTML. And since we're laying out our page here, what we can do next is do some CSS. So this is okay so far. Let's do a little CSS. We'll jump into CSS here, and we'll just do our body tag, and we'll target body, and we'll do the opening and closing curly braces, and I'll do margin. We've done this in the other one, so margin 36 pixels. We'll stick with that. Semicolon. We'll put a background color. I'll put sky blue, you know, like the ocean, and then you can always adjust it. You could hover over here, and if you want to make it a little darker, you could do that. That's fine. And then we'll make the font size a little bigger. Font size 110%. H1, I guess we could do it now. H1, and we'll do color, and I'll just put pink. I'll choose pink, I'll put a semicolon, and then I'll hover over it. And if you want it a little more, I'll hover again. I'll move this thing, I guess, up in the orange a little bit more, and choose something like that. See how that looks. Like I said, I haven't found a good color that works with that blue. And if I refresh, there we go. See, it's still hard to see, so we'll have to change that. Maybe I'll make that pink a little bit darker. I'll hover here, and I'll just go a little darker for now. Maybe I'll do a little more fuchsia kind of color. We'll see how that purple color looks. That's a little better. It's darker than I wanted. I wanted kind of a Patrick color, but that's showing up nice for now. That looks okay. Our buttons look okay. And what we want to do next is put Patrick in the page. Now, how do we put Patrick on the page? Now, this will be in your instructions, but where you'll go is in your index. We'll put the image on here, and I'll show you what to do. After here, and what I'm going to do first, before I put my image, is I'm going to type BR and hit tab, and then hit BR and tab. That'll put 2 line breaks. We'll put a little space underneath the buttons. And now underneath here, I'm going to do my image. So I'll do image, and I'll hit tab. And in my alt tag, remember, that's just a description of the image. I'll just put Patrick pick. And in the source, that's where the source is. And where we're going to get this, we're going to use HTTPS, and the S means secure, https:// and it's homa.wcc.github.io/patrick.png. I believe. We'll see if I got that right. https://homawcc.github.io/patrick.ping. We'll see if it works. If I could see Patrick, then I have it right. If not, I'll look it up and make sure I have the right address. But it'll be on your sheet, and I'll have a link to it so you can use that. But let's see if it works. I'll hit run. I'll go here, and I'll refresh. Now there's Patrick. Now that's the one I want, so that works. So that's the right URL for that. And I want to make him a little bit smaller. Now, if I needed to know what size he is, like who knows what size he is, but if I right click on here and I do inspect, I can hover over Patrick and I see that he's 392 by 432. So his width is 392, his height is 432. This is in Chrome. And 392, maybe I'll make him 300. That's what I did on my original one. So I'll change it to 300, or if I did 320, something like that. I'll go here, and I could put it in here, but where I really want to put it is in my style.css. And before I do that, instead of just targeting IMG, this is an attribute. SRC is an attribute, alt is an attribute. I'll put another attribute, and another attribute I'll put is going to be ID. I'll put ID equals, and then in quotes, I'll put Patrick. we're just going to call him Patrick. Just like this ID is button 1, this ID is button 2, this ID is going to be Patrick. So it's a way to identify that element with a special name. And the image ID is Patrick. And then we could use that to identify Patrick. Now, if we go into our styles and we identify Patrick, we have to do it with a pound sign. And we put a pound sign, we put Patrick. That's an ID named Patrick. If it was a class name, we would use a dot. And we're using ID because it's a little bit easier to use when we use JavaScript. And it's a little more common. It's not always the most efficient way, but it's going to work fine for us. So we're going to target Patrick ID and put our opening, closing curly brace. And what we'll do is we'll just put width, and I'll make it 320 px. Make sure you put the semicolon. So width 320 px. And if I go here, I'll close this thing up and I refresh it. He's a little bit smaller, so that should work out okay. And actually, we're going to start him off so he's transparent. And actually, sometimes what I'll do is I'll do something like this. I'll put opacity, which is a CSS property. I'll put opacity. And inside here, opacity goes from 0 to 1. It doesn't go from 0% to 100%. It goes from 0 to 1. So if it was 50%, if you put 0.5 in here, if I put 0.5 and I went here and I refreshed it, he's 50% opacity. So it uses decimals for opacity. And sometimes that's helpful. I might even make it go down to like 0.25 for now because I want to make sure he's there and I want to see him there. So I'll just leave him there for now, but I want to make sure that that's kind of his starting point before I make him completely transparent. So I'll make sure I can still see him. And then when I show him, and he'll be 100%, and when I hide him, he'll be 0%. But that's what we're going to do with JavaScript. So far we have our index HTML complete, I think. We have our ID for button 1, our ID for button 2. We have an ID for Patrick. So we're going to use these IDs in JavaScript to target the button, to identify the buttons, and to identify the Patrick image in order to make things happen to it. And all that's going to happen is Patrick is either going to be 0% opacity or 100%. And we already know how to do that. And it's using the script that's in our JavaScript, which we don't have anything there yet. So there's nothing here yet, but that's what we're going to do in the next video. So I think we're okay. We have all our HTML done so far, and we have our link to our JavaScript. We have our CSS done. I don't think we have to do anything else unless we change the color of our headline. And then what we're going to do in part 2 is we're just going to do the JavaScript, and that won't take that long. So we'll see you back here in part 2.